mentioned there was a slaughter of North Korea. There was, as far as I know, bombing everything to the ground.
Yep.
What year was that?
This was between 50 and 53.
Right. And what you've said, what you've described explains that, because you're talking about a revolution that had spread to every corner of the land. And so everything had to be wiped out according to imperialism. They couldn't just bomb a center.
Yeah. Every city, every town, except for maybe one, maybe 3 or 4, literally just 3 or 4, were bombed to the ground. The casualties, and I forget the percent, but it was in the millions. Okay? Yeah, it was a very devastated country. And the U.S. saw that as a jumping point off to China, of course, which, of course, the Chinese didn't quite appreciate, which is why they went into Korea to prevent that. But anyhow, go ahead.
Okay, well, I actually have 3 questions. Got 1,000 questions, but I'll reduce it to 3. Okay, first question is, to what extent is there any vestige of Marxism-Leninism taught, say, to the cadre of the Workers' Party?
Yeah.
The second, you mentioned a family analogy, which seems to justify the succession of grandfather, father, and then grandson, in the leadership. To what extent does that apply to other areas of the leadership of North Korean society? In other words, do they have a family succession going on, let's say for the mayor of a large city, or whatever the equivalent position is? And the third one is, are there any native Korean historical antecedents to the structure that they have in North Korea now?
You started back.
What was the first question again?
Okay, just, are there any vestiges of the Marxism-Leninism ideology being taught, say, to the party cadres?
Yeah. Okay, in relationship to the first. People are familiar with Marxism-Leninism. Students are taught it just like they're taught about feudalism. It's a stage that they went through. Okay?
Interesting.
I mean, that's about it. Right? Those that are theoreticians, right, are obviously more familiar with it, right, and can, according to what I've read of people who question the theoreticians, they can go into a lot of detail about Marxism-Leninism, but they can also go into a lot of detail about feudalism too, the feudalist ideology.
So they don't condemn it.
That is the past, okay, not the present. The family analogy, I'm a little bit less familiar with. Certainly the Kim family does occupy certain leading positions within the party and within the country, because obviously they're part of the descendants of the Supreme Leader's family. Okay? But how wide and how deep that is, I'm just not that familiar with. Historical antecedents, I'm really weak on that. I have seen so many contradictory things that trace things back historically, and others that criticize that, tracing it back and saying no, that's not true, that they're not going on specific historical antecedents. And my knowledge of Korean history, right, begins with Kim Il-sung.
Okay.
Right? I never went any further, right? That's why this is an in progress thing.
Yeah.
Okay? So I mean, that's
Yeah, I had also read that so much, I don't even know. I had also read that so much of North Korea, especially, was
a
destroyed.
little louder.
So much of North Korea was destroyed.
Yeah.
And it seems to me the philosophy of the military is, it's practically the realization that what a country needs to do to survive is have power, military power being paramount. So when you take that practical reality and you raise it to the level of ideology, is a way of continuing it and having it grow and permeate the population. So I see that all born of necessity, in a way. But what I'm wondering about is the problem with any bit of power when it spreads from one, when it just permeates through one family, let's say, is that it eventually becomes self-serving. And the self-serving aspect of it can trump any ideology after a while, or find ways around it. So are there criticisms along those lines, not coming from the West, let's say, because the West will say whatever it has to say, but do you know of criticisms coming from within about the limitations of that kind of, what I call a self-serving perpetuation of power within one focused group? You know, do you know of any that are coming from radicals within?
Let me take.
West, you know.
Is that okay? Yeah. Let me take two aspects of that. The one I know more about, the one I know least about. I agree that the devastation of the Korean War made an impact on what later became Songun. Okay, but even, and that's why I emphasize even before that, back in the 1930s, when Kim Il-sung laid the reason for the weakness of Korea in relationship to China and Japan, to its lack of military strength. Okay, when you look at that, Korean War reinforces that. Okay, everything after the Korean War reinforces that even more. So that yes, the ideology grows out of that. Not only that, other things that I mentioned, but grows out of that, and is perpetuated by that. And there, the part of the ideology is that so long as imperialism exists, that Songun will exist. Now, as a relationship to the second part, the answer is I have never read any internal critiques along those lines. Okay? I have heard about persons who've left the DPRK who have such critiques. Okay? And they obviously might have had them while they were in, North Korea. But I've never read anything about about any internal critiques. If individuals do have those critiques, they don't publicly usually say them. It wouldn't be advisable. Yeah.
So, first I have a couple just factual things. I don't remember you. This is going for the.
Thank you.
This isn't for the.
Yeah, for the video.
So the first one is I don't remember you saying the population of north or south before, earlier or now, which would help me to know how many people we're talking about roughly in the north and the south over the 50, 70 years. This one for this.
For recording.
I know it isn't. I know what it is.
I see.
And then the second thing I was wondering about was Juche sounds like the Korean way of saying Ho Chi Minh's most famous quote, nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. But then I'm wondering, was there a relationship between the Vietnamese, not just Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese and Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh, and the North Koreans? What kind of a relationship? Did they talk? Did they?
Between Vietnamese?
Yeah, the Vietnamese and the Koreans during Kim Il-sung's time, especially. That might be, let's see, there's another thing. No, that's good enough. I had another question.
Okay. The figures escape me right now, but the South has more people than the North.
The North
And
is
I think
inside
historically, I mean, at least since the end of World War II, the South has had more people than the North. But
I think it's 25 million in
It's
the
around
north.
25 million in the north.
50 in the south.
And how much?
50 million in the
50.
So
Okay.
75. Yeah.
Right.
okay, in relation to Vietnam, Vietnam is a revisionist country, but that doesn't mean that they don't have good relationships on certain levels. Like they've tried to have trade relationships with the Vietnamese. During the Vietnamese War, there was a engineering unit of the Korean People's Army that served in North Vietnam, and also Korean pilots flew Soviet MiGs with Vietnamese insignia on them, so that the Korean pilots fought the Americans in the air. That's about all I can say.
So first I'll make a few comments and then I'll ask. I have actually a lot of questions, but I'll ask one. So the comments are several. So one is that in terms of the, because there was a question about what are the historical antecedents to the, the sort of family succession. And I would say that first of all, that you have 2,000 years of dynasties of the emperor, and which is of course hereditary. And so that is sort of the historical framework for people, the population sort of very readily accepting a family succession. In terms of the military, I mean, so one of the things that, if you look at it from the Western perspective, is that, well, North Korea has the fourth largest military in the world, and that, for a country of 25 million, that sounds really extraordinary. But, what I observed is that the military is there as preparation to, obviously, to defend the country, given the history of what North Korea has gone through, particularly with the Korean War, and so you have all these people under the military, over 1 million in the regular military, plus the reserves. And what do they do with their time? Well, they're not always doing military exercises, so they're spending most of their time just simply being there and harvesting the crops, building roads, doing so. A lot of the construction, a lot of the building construction is done by the military, and so this is sort of the ultimate integration of the military into the economy. I mean, this is in addition to military enterprises, arms factories, and even food. Some of the food processing. I mean, they're into a lot of different industries.
That means they're workers.
They're also workers. So they are soldiers and also workers. One thing that when I was there in 2015, I did not hear much of any talk about Songun. We heard a lot. We were constantly told about Juche, but nothing about Songun. And of course, this was before Byungun. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, the origins of Juche, as you said, it starts around 1958. So there's another correlate here, which I'm wondering whether there is a relationship to, which of course is the Great Leap Forward in China, because the Great Leap Forward in China is a non-Marxist ideology of self-reliance. So I'm just wondering whether there's a relationship between those.
What's